Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Julie Casey. I'm the librarian for Open Access and Scholarly Communication at the Harvard Law School Library. And I would like to welcome you to this, our second faculty book event for fall 2013. We are here today to celebrate the launch of Bob Verdone and Nancy Rogers and Craig McEwen and what's his name?
Frank Sanders.
Frank Sanders, designing systems and processes for managing disputes, which we have a wonderful panel here today, which will be an engaging discussion on this topic. Seated next to Professor Verdone is Nancy Rogers, who is co-author emeritus Michael E. Moritz Chair in Alternative Dispute Resolution at the Ohio State University College of Law. And besides Professors Rogers and Verdone, we also have HLS visiting Professor Kenneth Feinberg, who is also well known as the administrator of the 911 and BP Gulf Spill Compensation Funds. And also seated at the far end, we have Kathy Costantino, who is counsel of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation and adjunct professor at Georgetown University Law Center. And if you purchase the book, which we have over here on the table with the group, you'll be able to read more about Kathy in the appendix section as designer profiles, which I enjoy very much. Before we begin, I'd also like to thank the Dean's Office for providing lunch for us today. If you haven't already gotten lunch, please feel free to get up to the back of the room and get some refreshments. And I'd also like to mention, for those of you who I hope will be able to have questions at the end of our presentation, that your remarks will be recorded as part of the audio of today's event. So without further ado, Bob.
Thanks, June. Thanks, everyone, for being here today. I'm really honored that so many of you came, friends and students and mentors and colleagues, and really honored that two of my co-authors are here, Nancy Rogers sitting to my left and Professor Frank Sander, who's sitting in the second row. So special thanks for joining today. And also just really delighted and a little bit intimidated by the two other panelists, Ken Feinberg and Kathy Costantino, who are heroes to me and people from whom I've been learning since I was a student. I actually remember as a third-year law student sitting in a very early version of a dispute systems design class that as a research assistant I actually helped kind of put together with Professor Radukud, who's sitting right in the front row. And I remember Ken Feinberg speaking in that class and thinking, wow, I hope someday he'll even say hello to me.
Hi.
Reading, so thank you. So this is really exciting for me. Let me just give you a kind of a sense of what we're hoping to do. We know some of you have class at 1, so if people get up at 12:55 to leave, we will construe that as you're going to class, not that as you are deathly bored. If you get up before then, we will construe it as you're deathly bored. We're going to probably go a little bit past 1 so that there's some time for questions. I'm going to just speak briefly. Some of you know a lot about systems design. Some of you probably don't know anything about it. So I'm going to define it, say a few words about why we did the book, and then tell you a little bit about the book, a little bit about the content, and then some of the features in the book. And then we'll have some time for our panelists to make some remarks and some time for you to have questions. I have pledged to speak no more than 15 minutes and will buzz myself if I'm not done by then. So let me just offer you a definition for dispute systems design. People sometimes say, what is this? So a definition that I use is the intentional creation of a set of dispute handling procedures to help an organization or an institution, a nation, or any set of individuals better manage a particular conflict or alternatively a continuous stream of conflict. So it's a pretty wide definition of what systems design is. I think the two things that I want to stress, right, is the word design, that is intentional creation, not haphazard creation of random processes over some period of time, and system, that is often more than one process that kind of interact and work with each other. And this is a field that, in some sense, kind of came from ADR, and really the first book there are kind of 4 books that preceded our textbook. The first one came out in 1988. It's called Getting Disputes Resolved by some of our colleagues here at PON. And then in 96, Kathy Costantino and her colleague Christina Sickles-Merchant wrote a second book, Designing Conflict Management Systems. And then 2 other books that came later, Controlling the Cost of Conflict, and then Designing Systems for Managing Workplace Conflict in 2003. So it's kind of been a decade since a book has been written on this, and the question is, well, if there are 4 books that are all excellent, why another book? What's the advantage of writing another book? So let me give you a few reasons. I'm going to start with maybe a personal and selfish reason. Those of you who know my 3 co-authors on this book know that they are legends in our field, amazing, wonderful, mentoring people who, in many respects, co-founded the field. So for me, when I was asked to be a part of this, right, just the opportunity to actually work with them seemed like a really good idea, and to collaborate. We also had some reasons for the book specifically. One is I had been running I had started a clinic on dispute systems design. And it seemed to me that putting together a book would create an opportunity to really enhance students' own self-confidence in their ability to take design initiative in various capacities that they may find themselves in professionally down the road, whether they became dispute systems design people or just in their ordinary lives as lawyers. And so we thought that there was a real opportunity to kind of fill a gap in the literature, to create a text that was really comprehensive, that was useful across context. So the 4 earlier books were quite context-specific, often embedded within an organizational context. We wanted to do something that was really interdisciplinary. So 3 of the 4 of us have the authors have a background in law. One of our co-authors actually has a background in sociology. And we knew that our field is very interdisciplinary, and creating something that would be interdisciplinary would be additive. And then we wanted a resource with lots and lots of examples, with lots of practical stories. So that was kind of what was driving us. In terms of the book itself, I'm going to kind of start with an overview of kind of the content. And essentially what we try to do is, broadly speaking, we have kind of 4 big steps in disputes in the design process. Now, this is a little bit misleading because by steps you get the sense that they're totally sequential. And in fact, lots of times you're looping from one step to the other back and forth. We've organized it roughly in this sequential way. And the first of these is what we call taking design initiative. This is actually, it's interesting, some of the feedback that I've gotten about the book in its early days is that you never know what people are going to find interesting, and people have said, this is one of the most interesting ideas in your book. In my mind, all it is the idea that any ordinary person embedded in some situation where conflict is happening, disputes are happening and not happening well, or not being resolved well, can do something about it, can take some actual individual initiative to make a change. And giving people some tools for doing that and some real examples for doing that. So that's the first step, right? You don't have to be a dispute systems design person to do dispute systems design work. There are some people who do that professionally, some people who don't. Once you've kind of made that decision to get involved, a second step is really kind of assessing or diagnosing the current situation. So bringing that down a bit, right? It's first helping identify who are the stakeholders involved, right? What are the underlying conflicts that come up in this organization? What are the ways in which the conflicts are getting handled? That's the assessment work, and then that helps you kind of get a sense of, is there some path forward, and what might that look like? So bringing it down a little bit more. As you think about stakeholders, what are the kinds of questions someone might ask? Well, sometimes people limit it to who is actually in the conflict at the moment, but that's often too limiting. By doing a stakeholder assessment is who actually kind of cares about this conflict, who might be affected by the conflict. If you're going to make some changes institutionally or organizationally, who was needed to implement it, to support it, to make it happen, what kind of expertise do you need to bring to the table? So that's kind of what we mean by identifying stakeholders. And there's a big portion of the book that talks about this. In terms of looking at underlying conflicts, this is kind of looking at who are the actual people within an organizational or institutional context who are getting into the conflict. What are the conflicts about? How frequently do they occur? And might there be some deeper reasons, right? If you see a recurring kind of dispute or conflict, might there be some deeper causes than a dispute over whose job this was or who failed to do X, Y, or Z? So it's a real kind of assessment of what's happening right now within the organization. The third step is looking at how do people within this institutional or organizational context currently deal with their conflict. So that's kind of broadly at two levels. First of all, what are the procedures that institutionally are currently in place for the management of conflict? They might be legal or extra-legal, formal or informal. Then how are people actually taking advantage of or using those procedures? But then more broadly, quite apart from what's available, what do people actually do just when they're in a situation of conflict, right? So one of the things that is interesting, right, sometimes people don't express it at all. They sit around the water cooler and kvetch. Or they leave the organization, imposing huge costs because they leave, right? So what's in place, right, and then what do people actually do? And kind of assessing what that gap is. And then from there, it helps you kind of assess, is there kind of a path forward? That is the situation or context right for a systems design? Is there enough kind of institutional interest and motivation or not? So step two. Now, if you say the answer to that question is no, right, there's not a rightness, there's no interest, you probably don't move on to step three, at least at the moment. You might think about what could I do to change that over time. But assuming that the answer is yes, you then move on to kind of step three, right, creating systems and processes. So our book talks about this pretty extensively. One of the things we really talk about, and I'm just going to give you kind of one slide on this, is assuring that the system or process you design is aligned carefully to the goals that you have for it. And so we talk broadly about kind of 6 goals that one might have and then have some strategies for that. So a system design that actually tries to find ways to overcome barriers to reaching agreement. A very typical reason, right, sometimes what gets people motivated to do systems design work is they're simply interested in reducing the time and expense of conflict. Another possible goal might be thinking in a prophylactic or preventive way, right? How do we kind of set up processes that operate in advance of disputes? Sometimes the interests of stakeholders are deeper. It's not just about resolution, but it's maybe about reconciliation or healing, or sometimes justice, or sometimes some combination of those things, which suggests a different kind of design. Sometimes, right, the system wants to arrange the processes in some intentional sequence. So, for example, from lower to higher cost, or from lower to higher risk. Sometimes you want to design a system that encourages kind of creativity around the resolution of a set of conflicts. So, okay, then the last kind of step is thinking about how do you actually implement the design. And where implementation includes both setting it up, but also evaluating how well is the system working, and how can it kind of adapt to change needs and conditions over time. So the kind of key concerns we address in the book there are first of all, thinking about what are the resources you need to actually do the implementation. So where might there be resistance, either because of current incentive systems, because of costs, because of skill sets. How do we set the conditions up to improve the climate for implementation? How do we marshal the resources, both in terms of finances, but sometimes just in terms of time and stakeholders to actually make this happen? And then how do you get buy-in institutionally, the leadership, to kind of make it happen? So I think, given my interests, I'm going to pause here and not do a detailed overview of the design features. I'll simply say, you kind of, in addition to this content, the book has kind of 4 things that we think are kind of special. We follow 6 different case studies throughout the book that really start in chapter 1 and kind of continue throughout the whole book. They're in very different domains: international and domestic, public, private, in the government sector. Some of the case studies involve people who very much saw themselves as systems designers. Some of them involve people who just found themselves in a situation that wasn't going so well, where they thought they could make a difference, and that was an intentional choice. We also have some kind of what I'm calling specific word problems, but some little sample kind of cases throughout the book that instructors can be selective about in terms of what they use. One of them, which is based on a hypothetical university called Tallahoya University, continues throughout the book, but then we have a bunch of others. We also have these kind of insets throughout the book on various practical strategies. So really nuts and bolts of how do you do an assessment, or what are some skills that are required for being a good systems designer. And then lastly, as June alluded in her introduction, we have 4 stories of actually kind of autobiographical sketches of 4 people who have become dispute systems designers in their own careers. We sought out 4 people who have very different stories and are very different parts of their career. So someone who literally graduated from this law school in 2006 and founded a firm that does dispute systems design, to others who are more established kind of in government or private practice. So I am going to pause here. I think I've gone 2 minutes over my pledged amount. I apologize. And I'm going to turn it over to, do we have a sequence of who would like to speak first?
Does Nancy want to speak?
Nancy, would you like to
I'll
speak
wait for the
first?
questions, yeah.
Ken, I defer to the senator on my right.
A couple of things, just briefly. It's a must read, this book. But
He's been paying nothing for this.
but it's sort of counterintuitive. In my work, I would not read this book. I'm just telling you why this is a handbook. It's after I have an assignment that I go to this book for guidance or resource. I'm not reading this in advance of a specific dispute. And now that I've got a specific dispute, how might I learn from this? Now, I must say, before commenting on a few aspects, that are substantive aspects in this book, you have, this is quite a day, you have in this room, right now, the greatest array of ADR talent since I think Frank Sander had breakfast by himself. You've got Frank Sander, the founder of the modern ADR movement, the founder of the modern ADR movement. You've got Nancy Rogers, who made ADR a staple of the law school curriculum in this country. You've got Bob Bourdon, who is one of the foremost creative thinkers in not only ADR, but systems design, so that you now have classes in systems design, not the substantive mediation skills, but even getting the system set up. You've got Kathy Constantino, who has taken that one step further and is actually designing systems in her work. And eating lunch, you've got Bob Mnookin. Now, Bob Mnookin has taken ADR, broadened it internationally, gone way beyond law, to now use ADR principles and the systems that are talked about in this book in setting up social and political systems to deal with the Middle East, to deal with everything that goes beyond the narrow legal construct. I don't know when next you'll find this array of talent in one room. It's worth my being here just to break bread with the other people that are on this panel and in the audience. Now, where I find this book particularly helpful in my own work is not in the one-on-one mediations, Fortune 500 company versus insurance company, wholesaler versus retailer. Rather, when I was thumbing through this book, it is when I am asked to take on mass claims. Mass claims, 7,500 claims in 9/11. 1,200,000 claims arising out of the BP oil spill. 240 claims arising out of the Boston Marathon bombings. 100 claims arising out of the Virginia Tech shootings. I mean, it's in the mass claims context that this book is particularly valuable. And when you read through it, Bob articulated very well some of the sort of the bedrock principles. But from a mechanical point of view in implementing a program to try and resolve mass claims, interspersed in this book, in different words, in different sections, there are really four principles. Four principles that guide me in designing a claims system. Four, every time. Every time. One, what is the mission? What is my mandate? What do policymakers who are stakeholders, what do policymakers tell me in a 9/11 statute, in a BP handshake between the president and BP, when you meet with the mayor of Boston and the governor of the Commonwealth? What is the mandate? Ken, will you design a system? Well, what do you want me to do? What's the mission, the mandate, the charter? That's one. Till I know that, there's not much I can do. I want to know what I'm supposed to do. What's the mission? Two, in rolling out the system, how objective can you make it? How objective? I do not want to get involved in a system that requires a great deal of subjectivity. Subjectivity in mass claims processing is anathema. Beware. Beware too much subjective authority being delegated to one person, so that inevitably with subjectivity comes good faith disagreement and difference, fueling divisiveness. So you want as much objectivity as possible. The book talks about this. The book talks about objectivity. Three, very important part of this book, how transparent do you make the process? Sunlight. Everybody, you may not like it, but here's the way the system's going to work. Full transparency, openness, no hidden agendas, no secret deals. It's all there, laid out, so that anybody can take pot shots at it or say what you want, but there it is, and we're not hiding anything to go with objectivity and an understanding of the mission. And then finally, the importance discussed in the book of procedural due process. In a mass claim program, how far can you go in giving each and every claimant the right to be heard? the right to vent, the right to come and talk with the claims administrator. Do not underestimate the way I did before I got involved in some of these mass claims. Do not make the mistake I made. Do not shunt aside as secondary procedural due process. It's all too easy in the interest of efficiency of mass claims processing to ignore procedural due process. Look, our goal is to get the money out, get it out fast. We don't have time for individual hearings. Beware of that. The way I found through experience that you get stakeholders who have claims to buy in to the process is by giving them the right to be heard. It's very difficult when you have 1,200,000 claims in the Gulf of Mexico, as opposed to 7,300 claims in 9/11, or 240 claims in the Boston Marathon. But procedural due process is, to me, an essential bedrock principle, discussed at great length in this book. So mission, objectivity, transparency, and procedural due process in at least mass settings are important. And from this book, you go and you get ideas and maybe ways to do this in setting up the system. So it's a handbook. It is a valuable, valuable resource to anybody interested in ADR. It sort of provides a blueprint, elements of how you set up programs. And that's why if I get an assignment next week to deal with the U.S. Navy Yard shootings last week, or Fort Hood, or the 19 Arizona firemen who died in Prescott as a result of the forest fire and the flash fire. And somebody says to me, well, how are you going to set up a program like, well, let's see what ideas, I have some ideas, but let's see what other creative concepts come out of this valuable resource. So there we are.
Thanks, Ken. And thank you for inviting me. I also want to just thank the FDIC because I'm here not on vacation. I'm here in my official capacity, which is really great, because usually I come up on my own dime and my own time, so thank you to them. I also just want to thank Nancy and Bob, because now no one will buy my book, because now this book is outdated, and no one will be using my book as a textbook anymore, so thanks a lot, guys. Really good job. Keep it up. Good work, okay? Also want to thank Frank Sander. It was interesting, in 1991, I came up and did a quick lecture for one of Frank's classes, and I said, you know, Frank, I'd really like to teach law school at some point. What should I do? And he said, oh, I don't know, that's not a good idea. And I said, no, I'd really like to do this, Frank. I would really like to do that. And he said, well, good, where did you go to law school? And I said, you know, Frank, I went to Berkeley. He said, that's good. He said, did you clerk at the trial level? I said, no. He said, ooh, that's bad. He said, did you clerk at the appellate level? I said, no. He said, did you work for a big law firm? I said, yeah. And then I started doing bank fraud prosecutions during the first S&L crisis. And he said, you know, Kathy, you need to write a book. So I said, okay. So I wrote a book, and it is my great privilege now to be reviewing and be able to write the review for the very person who really got me into this field. So a great thank you to Frank. And by the way, I like your new book, Frank. It gets a plus, all right? It gets an A+ in my class. There is a book review that you can pick up. It's called Hitting the Trifecta. It's going to be in the October issue of the Negotiation Journal. I wrote it. I titled it Hitting the Trifecta because this book is really about three things. It is a terrific, can I have a prop here? Yeah, okay, I need a prop, okay? I got the prop here, okay? You should buy this book, or you should like this book, because it is a terrific textbook. If you are a student or if you are a professor, you're gonna like this book. It's got no case citations anywhere, none, okay? There's white space in this book, like there's margins, okay? There's boxes that are shaded. There's suggestions for papers. There's suggestions for additional research. Very, very, very practical, all right? It doesn't look like any other law school text that I've ever seen, and that's good. Okay, I think that's a very good thing. The other thing about it is that it is a terrific resource. As Ken said, if you have a question about something, or what about this, or what's been done about that, this is like, I know we don't really have encyclopedias anymore, I guess, but it's the encyclopedia of systems design. And for the first time ever, it's really everything all in one place. And thanks to the authors of this book, I am no longer going to schlep my colored boxes to my systems design class with all my materials anymore, because it's all right here. It's all right here. My husband's going to love it because he doesn't have to load my car anymore with 4 boxes when I go off to teach. So that as well. The other thing is that when I first titled the review, I called it future seer, or I thought of the idea of being able to see into the future, crystal ball. This book is really a roadmap, all right? This book really tells you where systems design has gone, but more importantly, it tells you where it's going to go, which I think is really important. We're at a real crossroads now in legal education, and there's a lot of discussion about what is it, what should it be, who are we training to do what. I have a theory, and I have a theory that when I teach here at Harvard Law School and I teach at Georgetown, I don't train lawyers anymore. I stopped doing that about 3 years ago. I do not train lawyers. I do not teach lawyers. I do not teach law students. I teach future leaders. I teach people that are going to be the next Ken. I teach people that are going to be up on the Hill and figure out how the hell they should come to a budget agreement by next Monday. I might be stranded in Boston, which would be okay, but in any event, they are the next leaders that are going to be up on the Hill. They're going to be the NGOs of tomorrow. They're going to be the Colin Rules of tomorrow. They're going to be the people that are going to be thinking about this going forward. And that's why this book is just such a terrific book. It's not about what. Law school gets fixated on what. I don't care about what. When I design a system, I don't care about what. Ken's kind of the master of disaster, okay? When there's the disaster, you get Ken. A lot of the designs that I do are behind the scenes. They're behind the scenes during the banking crisis. They're behind the scenes during the savings and loan crisis. They're behind the scenes with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. They're behind the scenes with the United Nations in Uganda. I don't get to do what Ken does, and by the way, what Ken does is incredibly important and incredibly taxing. I'll tell a little story about Ken just to make it come to life. When he lectures in my systems design class on Saturday morning at 9 a.m. Every year, comes in at Saturday morning at 9 a.m. to Georgetown. And he once told the story about when he first got appointed to be the master of the 9/11 fund, that you were having breakfast, I think, with your daughter is what you told me. And you said, did you ever in your wildest dreams, he knows the story, okay? Did you ever in your wildest dreams think that I would be the person overseeing 7,300 claims in this kind of a disaster? And he says, my daughter looked at me and said, Dad, in my wildest dreams, I don't dream about you. True story, right, Ken? Yeah, okay. So trust me, in my wildest dreams, I don't dream about Frank, and I don't dream about Bob, and I don't dream about Nancy, and I don't even dream about Craig. But I do dream about the future of systems design, because this is it. You want a job in the legal market? This is the future. This is about process. This is about preemption. This is about prevention. This is about social justice. It's much more than just a textbook. It will not make you richer. It will not make you thinner. It will not make you better looking, but it will. It will give you a leg up in the legal field. It will make you forward thinking. It will get you in touch with what's going on out there, not in the classroom necessarily, not in the academic environment. And I tend to have this, I don't know what the word is, I tend to think in sets of 3. I don't know, I'm sure there's some Freudian reason for that. I have no idea what it is. But I think about trifectas and I think about 3s, okay? When I think about this book, I think about the Wizard of Oz, all right? I think about the straw man who wanted a brain. This book is brilliant, and I'm not just saying that. This book is brilliant, all right? A lot of intelligence in this book, a lot of really, really forward thinking. I think about the lion, okay? Remember the Cowardly Lion? The lion wanted courage, all right? This book is courageous. It is not a traditional law school text. It goes a new way. Somebody had some courage to write this book, all right? And I think about the Tin Man who wanted a heart, All right? I think about the Tin Man because, and this book is about heart. It's about social justice. It's about transparency. It's about involving the stakeholders. It's about process. So I want to congratulate the authors on being the Wizard of Oz. And I thought what I might do is just pitch a question back to the authors. And we know the book is brilliant. I mean, Ken's already told us that, okay? They got a brain. We got that. I'm going to ask a compound question. Ken teaches evidence, so don't object, Ken, okay? It's all right. And I thought I might ask Bob, what gave you the courage to write this book? Because it's different. It's either courage or stupidity. I'm not certain which, okay? There was courage in writing the book. So tell us a little about the courage of writing it. And for Nancy, I want to pitch the question of what went into this book, the heart of it. There's a real sense of dignity and process and transparency in this book that is different. So Bob gets the lion question, and Nancy gets the Tin Man question. Bob, courage.
Well, it's nice, and thank you, first of all, for both of you for those amazing remarks. It's interesting, it didn't feel to me like it was a big leap of courage. And I think for a number of reasons. First of all, right, I had these three people who had already done so much courageous work by starting a field that was, I think, when they started it, completely didn't fit in any way, shape, or form in law school, coming to me. Secondly, in some sense, the book was, I had been doing a lot of this work anyway, day to day, in the clinic that I had started a few years before. So in some sense, putting it all together is kind of another version of, whatever, coming out of the closet or something and saying, this is really valuable and important for lawyers. And I think being in a place that is very supportive of interdisciplinary work, I think being in a place that in many respects kind of has led in this field, made it easier. And I think being also at a big law school where there are opportunities for us to kind of experiment and think out of the box. But part of it was also just being observant. I very strongly feel that we do a very good job in law schools. I mean, you were speaking, Kathy, about the role of law schools. I think we do a good job in teaching certain domains of lawyering. So teaching, how to think like a lawyer. I think what we don't do so well is teach skills of kind of diagnosis and appropriate prescription. So we teach certain prescriptions, even to the degree that we teach negotiation well or mediation well. Those are specific prescriptions, just like litigation is. But it seems to me that part of our job as lawyers and as leaders is to be, if we're managing disputes, is to first look at a dispute and know what are the right questions to ask to kind of get at the heart of something so that we can actually come up with a prescription that makes sense. Even if we aren't equipped to do the prescription, we could always recommend to a specialist. And so for me, it was seeing a need. It was having the both example and support of people who've gone before me, and then just being in I think a place that was open to this. But I agree that I spend a lot of time explaining people, what on earth is this, and how does it fit in? But that also feels very mission-oriented and kind of exciting to me.
Nancy, on the heart question, there's a lot of dignity and there's a lot of issues in this book about process and people and stakeholders, which is a little bit unusual for a law school text, certainly welcome in the field. Tell us a little bit about the heart part of it, or your choice to go that direction with this book.
Well, this book, the idea for it came when I had become the Attorney General of Ohio with 4 days' notice in a kind of a tough situation. And when I got there, among other things going wrong, there were in 2 of our communities in Ohio existing bitter divides in the community that resulted from police actions that were cross-racial. And then after I became Attorney General, there was a situation in which a mother called the police because there had been bullets fired into their house the evening after their son refused to join a gang. And the police came in this community at about 3 in the morning, and out in front of the house was standing, as it turns out, although they didn't know who it was, the father and his son who had refused to join the gang. And the father had put a gun in his belt, and the police asked them both to hit the ground. The son did. The father, and this is all videotaped from the police cruisers, the father moved one arm, and so they shot the father about 20 times in front of the son. And obviously awful and really tragic. And visiting me was the legislator from that community, which was predominantly African American, and all of the police who responded at 3 in the morning were white. And as he said, even if there is not a basis for a prosecution here, in my heart, I believe that the police would have paused longer if this had been in a suburb. And something needs to be done. And so we began a process of trying to think what could be done in that situation to prevent future kinds of shootings like that. It's something the whole country faces. It was not just a community in Ohio. And I called in the Justice Department Community Relations Service and began working there. But one of the things I learned in time was that no one in that metropolitan area was stepping forward to begin a process. And it was a community with a lot of graduates from my class who had had dispute resolution, and a lot of attorneys who had been trained as mediators. And as I spoke to individuals, they said, "You don't understand, this is really complicated. This is really bitter. This is really different." And so I was not Attorney General long. It was just until the people of Ohio could elect an Attorney General to take over in the general election. But it was my determination to figure out how to teach dispute resolution differently in a way that led the people who really were in a position. Lawyers are, after all, very well respected in communities as people over time who can step forward. They know how to get other people involved. They know how to get the right people there. So that people could have the series of questions that might help them realize that they could do this without doing harm, even if they didn't manage to do good, that they could at least do no harm, and to give them a whole set of a variety of questions to see if they could figure out how to do some good, to help a community heal, but also to come up with solutions for change, a variety of kinds of things that they all felt and knew needed to happen. And so coming back, it was it was just the first thing that I did after doing just a little thinking, because you never call Frank Sander without thinking through things, was to call Frank and ask if he thought it was crazy to try to think not how to write the wonderful book Kathy Costantino has written, which is a kind of a book for people in the field that reflects her wonderful experience and specific context and very clear and helpful, but to think through how to create a sense among students that they could do the book themselves, that they could write a Kathy Costantino book in a context that was different, and that they could enter one like this and really, really do it. And, Frank did not need to write this book, but he has spent his life pouring out his wisdom and his ideas and his brilliance in support of building a better world. And so he did not hang up on me, and I am always grateful for that. And managed to help me to persuade Bob and Craig to come along, because there is so much I don't know. And we brought to it not only, I think, a joint determination to figure out how it is to reach those of you who I see out there, and I'm hoping will be the people to step forward in these communities and in many other settings. But also, I had taught dispute system design with Bob Mnookin, and I just unashamedly took all of the ideas that I'd learned in any context to try to put them into a book that might be useful to students. So there is heart there in the sense that I do think that it is not only, as most people think, that our Congress is polarized, but I think that our communities are as well. And that there are ideas that those of us in this room who have expertise could bring to bear and could do it with finesse and could help this country move a little bit better together.
Questions?
Ken, do you want to ask a question, or should we see if
let's
there are
go. We only
questions
have,
from-
we may lose some
Let's,
people.
We may
Let's
lose some
ask them.
people. Okay.
Open to
So
the room?
We wanted to create some opportunity for all of you to ask some questions of us or make some comments. Aminu.
Well, first of all, I would like to congratulate you and the other authors for a job well done. I haven't read the book, but after listening to the reviewers, I'm going to get one immediately after.
Wait till you see the movie.
So one of the reviewers actually rightly pointed out that this is not a traditional textbook. And the question that came into mind is, then how does it fit into a traditional law school? I mean, in Harvard, it may be accepted because we have mavericks, people who think differently. What is your agenda when you wrote the book? How do you intend or envision the book to be used, particularly within the legal academy? And as you mentioned that you also wanted it to be used outside the legal academy. And then the last quick question is, you described the book as interdisciplinary and cross-cultural. In what way is the book interdisciplinary and cross-cultural, particularly when a person, a non-American, perhaps pick the book? What is cross-cultural in the book that you think is worth emphasizing? Thank you so much for a wonderful job.
So thanks for that question, Aminu. This may be idealistic and unrealistic, but even in the past 5 or 6 years, we've seen dispute systems design offered at many more law schools than it was. And so my hope first is just over time, more and more schools will start to offer courses like dispute systems design. I also think, this is a moment for legal education in terms of, there are challenges to its relevance even being 3 years. I think that this kind of offers an important approach to what lawyering can be like and ought to be like. So I agree with Kathy that this is useful for all leaders. I also think it's useful for all lawyers, and I would kind of broaden it and say, it's useful for and this is one of the kind of brilliant things that I can say I did not contribute to the book. It was really Nancy and Frank and Craig, which is this idea of design initiative. And the importance of giving kind of a perspective that you have agency in the context in which you find yourself to do something, and that you might have some tools and some ways of thinking about it and some examples. So, my hope is that over time, more schools will start to see the value in a dispute systems design class. In the same way that 30 years ago, very few schools had a negotiation or a mediation class, and now most schools do. But I also hope it'll go broader than that, because I think whether you're in a school of public policy, a school even a design, there are ways that ideas in the book can be useful. In terms of your question on interdisciplinary, cross-cultural, I think one of our goals was to draw on a broader, maybe this is, Kathy was saying there's no cases, there's no case law in there. And part of it is we really wanted to draw on kind of social psychology, cognitive psychology. So how do people in conflict make decisions? How can that information around, for example, heuristics and biases be used as you build a design? In terms of the cross-cultural aspect, and Nancy, you may have some additional thoughts on any of this, I think that, first of all, we tried to kind of be modest, I think, in terms of what we know and what we don't know. And I think there's a lot we don't know. We certainly tried, we tried to use some examples that are kind of outside of just a US context. So 2 of our 6 examples are outside the US context. One is in South Africa, another is in Canada. We tried to include some examples in there that are somewhat cross-cultural, and I think an interesting challenge. I mean, one of the 4 people who wrote these design autobiography pieces was actually an LLM student here. He's Brazilian, and he is actually using the book. He actually teaches dispute systems design in Brazil, and this is the first semester he's using it. So it'll be interesting to see what resonated, and what didn't resonate so much, or what was limiting. Oh, well, thank you. Well, then I'll be interested in hearing your feedback as well. Yeah.
The other thing I would add to that question is that when Ken works in all the different environments he works in, they're each an individual culture or subculture. When he works down in the BP oil spill, that looks a lot different, I imagine, than it looks when he's doing the work up in 9/11 or at Penn State. And one of the things about the book that I think is reasonably brilliant is that there are the 2 examples that are outside the United States, but there's also an example of eBay and how they ran into cross-cultural issues in terms of how their online dispute resolution translated in, I think it was Italy. And there was some cultural fluency and cultural issues in terms of how one does that are addressed in the book. So I like to think of culture fairly broadly, and I think the book is very open to that, because I think as people who design, for example, Ken, there's always an underlying culture that you're dealing with. It might be organizational, it might be local, it might be geographic, but it's always out there. And the book is broad enough that it really talks about that. And I don't know, Ken, if you want to add anything or not, but culturals, it's all over the place. And that's what I like about the book, is it touches it in some traditional but non-traditional ways.
To what extent, though, does the book focus on getting stakeholders to buy into a process? I mean, all the time you spend in trying to get to yes is for naught if you can't get the disputants to buy into a process. I find there are 2 problems here in my work. One, trying to get disputants to agree to a process, to a system. Otherwise, you're just, you're a false prophet. You can't get people to buy in. What's the point? And then, after you get them to buy in, sort of external buy-in, now they're in. Getting them to be believers is very, very difficult sometimes. So it's not only, it's a wonderful idea, but how do you get people to buy in? And once they agree, at least in principle, how do you get them committed? It's very, very difficult to get skeptical people committed to a process designed to help them. They look at you and go, my mommy told me, be careful of anybody who's only trying to help you. And it's always a problem. I mean, it's frequently a problem. So.
Yeah, well, one of the things that we did was to try to raise the challenge to the highest point. So suppose you were in 1993 and the South African government refused to negotiate with any terrorists, defining anyone who was engaged in violence as doing that. And the insurgents couldn't come into South Africa because they would be arrested if it was known that they were there. And they had each posted positions. And the reason that we included the movie is to increase sales, but also because the movie is a drama in which people can really see how a single individual who never thought of himself as a designer, but we call him that, how he managed to move his way from people who weren't involved, calling people, moving together, how he had to create momentum, and he fortunately made notes of these sessions, and they're now available at a university in England so that you can see how he did it, what his goals were at every joint session, with every call that he made, to create enough momentum to do the kinds of things that would create more than a token commitment. And I think there are other examples, other than examples and interviewing folks who do it, like Ken and Kathy. I think that the thing is to realize that that's a huge issue, and that it's going to be a major part of your focus, and that every moment you are doing both things. You are both trying to get that buy-in, and you are trying to retain that interest and that engagement in a deep enough way to make a difference.
I mean, one of the things that, and one of the reasons why the book is so process-oriented is because it's one thing to think about what a better system might look like in theory and come up with brilliant ideas. Figuring out how to get people there and how to get them bought in and to have some ownership and make it happen, that's where the kind of real challenge is. And so hopefully, I think some of the stories in the book hopefully give some kind of hope that that's possible, and then there's some kind of advice or direction as well. Maybe should we take maybe one more question from all of you, if there is one? Professor Mnookin.
Well, first, I want to congratulate the authors on what really, I think, a monumental contribution. I think that I'm not sure just how many law school courses it's going to generate. I think some. But I think that both as a handbook and in terms of solidifying a subfield of process design, its importance cannot be exaggerated. And it's also a very good read. I mean, it's really an interesting book. And I think few will really read it from start to finish, except for students and those who are teaching them. But I think professionals, as a handbook, as Ken suggested, will find it enormously valuable. And I think you're really to be congratulated on it. I guess the question I have is two. First, in writing the book, what did you learn you didn't know before? Second, this is just because my mind always goes in this direction, I sort of ask myself, what are the inherent tensions in terms of the process you describe? Let me just give one, which is something I struggle with, okay? What I applaud hugely is the notion of encouraging, especially students, to have a sense of agency, that they can make a difference. In terms of conflicts, how willing should one be, I'm going to use a pejorative term, to be sort of self-promoting and insert oneself into it, where you really haven't been invited, to try to manipulate the stakeholders, because you feel you could help them, to sort of manipulate the stakeholders into choosing you. That's something I personally have often felt that tension. On the one hand, I thought, Jesus, this is really important. I'd love to do something. On the other hand, why me? And isn't it a little, how do I overcome, people might have a hard time believing this in me, but it's really kind of true. How do I overcome a certain reticence? One thing I admired, for example, about Roger Fisher. Boy, Roger never saw a conflict he didn't think he could help, and he was more than willing to just jump in and write to the Secretary of State and anybody else. I can't do that.
You're an academic. You can't.
No, yes. But I guess so I did that only as an example of a tension that I think is often there, which I think what's great about this is the book sort of says, well, damn it, get out there, help heal the world. You can make it better. Use your talents. I think it's great.
I'll tell you where I see a real tension in my work. Mass claims, I mentioned it. Assembly line justice. You've got thousands of people waiting for money. Get the money out the door. Speed. Designing a system objective so that the contrast between traditional ways of dispute resolution and the design that will deliver compensation in record time runs up against procedural due process. You cannot tell everybody you're going to get money in 30 days if people say, well, I don't want the money yet until I have a chance to be heard. Slowing down the train, and how you resolve that tension between efficiency, cost effectiveness, the deliverable, versus everybody has their own claim, and it's the most important claim in the world. Nobody cares about the other thousands of claims, just my claim. That's a tension.
Ken, I want to add one. It's just a footnote to that, in the terms of the things you mentioned. The desire of people to tell their stories and the yearning for individualized justice on the one hand, and you're saying, stay away from discretion. They can come talk to me as the claims administrator, but for God's sakes, don't tell me I get to decide within a big range about how much they get, because that poses all kinds of other issues. And that's another example.
It's a huge tension
that a designer that the book identifies that the designer has to worry about.
I would point out one other tension and then turn it back to the authors on the question of what they learned, the complete circle on that. And that is that I think the other big tension is how you get in. Who brings you in? When the president brings Ken Feinberg in, okay. That's real different than the president of the union bringing me in. It's very different than the commanding officer of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And so there's a little bit of a discussion in the book about entry and contracting. And by contracting, I don't mean how much money you make. I mean, what are the parameters of the agreement? What are the expectations? How do you manage them? You know what? We can do this, but not that. Oh, you want me to do that? Well, that might be a different stage. That might be, you got to learn to say no. Okay? We're all taught how to get to yes. You know, saying no is something that we don't do real well after age 2. And I think that we all can learn how to say no. And so that tension to me is how you get in, who brings you in, why do they bring you in? You want to talk about manipulation, you want to talk about sub-agendas and subcultures. There's lots of people who bring you in that really aren't interested in resolution. There's something behind the curtain, okay? And it's not the wizard. And so that whole entry and contracting thing to me is a huge tension. There's an assumption that once you're in, it's all okay. Not true, but at some point you need to back it up and say, who brought you in, how, and why? And to me, there's a lot of tension around that. I'd like to pitch it back to the two of you in terms of what you learned that you didn't, about when you wrote the book, that you didn't know before you wrote the book. I mean, you're students as well as academics, so I'm hoping you learned something.
Yeah. Well, you know, with the idea of the book being to prepare you for things that could go wrong so that you really would avoid doing wrong. Then it fell to us to try to identify as many of these kinds of dilemmas as possible and to set them out, along with any stories of people who had managed some ways that they saw of resolving them, but really to set them out not as resolved issues, but as these amazing tensions. And I think what we did was ask people. So, you know, we interviewed the man in the movie who is still available, and we asked him just these kinds of questions. We asked them of all of the people in the stories we could identify, Fortunately, Ken answers a lot in his wonderful book about the 9/11 Commission. So we tried to, and we learned so much from them about how one manages these difficult kinds of things. We even suggest, for example, on these tensions, when a part of the system is the idea that you're going to get rid of some of what we value in the traditional justice system to make it move more quickly, or to work in some better way, that one may need to vet the kinds of decisions you're making with a lot of people and see whether in that context it really does seem to fit hitting the main things and not, if it may be important that one of the things you don't take out is this ability to speak. Maybe that stays, even if a lot of other things like discovery go. But to try that out so that you really are trying it out with a lot of the stakeholders before you implement it.
I would just say I agree with all of these tensions, which are a huge part. Hopefully they're kind of mentioned in the book in some ways, and certainly they're experienced. And part of the reason for writing the book, which I didn't say, is to kind of supplement the clinical work that Nancy and I in particular were actually doing with our students, and we experienced them. In terms of things that I learned. There are things you learn in writing a book, but they're actually also incredibly applicable to the work. So one is how much I don't know. And related to that, therefore, is a sense of humility. I think that when you work in systems and organizations and in conflicts and you see a lot of patterns, sometimes in a short amount of time you think you could size something up. Because you're seeing dozens of these and they're super embedded in their situation. And maybe there's something to that. But I think more importantly is just if you're going to be in this line of work, having a sense of humility that stakeholders know more about their situation than you do. You can bring some expertise, but you have to remain really curious. And so, speaking for myself, part of the joy of writing the book was the phone calls that I had with Nancy and Craig and Frank, because we did this, except for actually one in-person meeting, we did it by very regular phone calls, and having a new set of questions after a phone call, right? Oh, I didn't think that through, and this is actually harder to kind of put down in paper than we thought, and speaking of tensions. There were all sorts of tensions involved in terms of how much do we kind of give them on a silver platter or leave as questions. Even one of the decisions that I think, in fact, I think you mentioned in your review, Kathy, and that we kind of talked about is we didn't give a primer on the basic ADR processes, and there were kind of pros and cons to that. So I think there were a lot of kind of tensions even in writing the book, and also in thinking, those of you who know me know that I tend to be more of an optimizer than a satisficer. And at some point realizing, actually there's a lot to offer here, and if I wait until I think I know everything about this field, this book will never happen. And so for me it was, and I think as Nancy says, it's like kind of through the interviews, right, realizing there's a lot that we don't know, right? This is edition 1. I think edition 2 will look quite different. And one of the things we're keen for, as time goes on, is feedback. And so it's obviously heartening to hear various versions of how this is some kind of new standard. And in my mind, this is kind of a new straw man. To kind of have people bounce off us and for us to kind of learn from. So,
and let me mention, Bob, this tension about putting yourself forward. I think that some of it stems from our lawyerly training and not just our academic one, which is we're accustomed to being asked and have a particular role in defining it and answering it. but also we're accustomed to being the one. And a part of the answer may well be that in a given situation, one, nobody's going to ask anyone. But secondly, we're not the one, although we're the one who might get the one, and we're the one who might make it easier for the one. And so to think about it differently than we would think of ourselves as lawyers is something we tried to bring the thinking about in this book, and in part through stories, that there are people who, it made no sense to be the ones in Northern Ireland, but they had the sense that they might be able to get the people in Northern Ireland who could make a difference, and prepare them and encourage them and do the same thing as really the book.
As fun as this has been, people probably have some other things I want to go to. So I just want to thank enormously all of our panelists for being here. And all of you, it really means a lot that you came. So thank you for coming, thank you for staying, and enjoy the rest of the food. And
Thank you, Ken.
buy a book.
Thank you, Ken. I love working with you. We just go off each other really well.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for
Thank
coming.
you.
Great to meet you.